Okay. Well, hello everybody, and welcome to APL Public Lecture Series. I'm Simin Dawoodi, and I have the great pleasure of introducing Professor Harriet Bulkeley for tonight's public lecture. And I say introducing, but I suppose given the limited time available to us, I'm not going to be able really to do justice to Harriet's impressive and significant contribution to our knowledge about climate change. So we've got to make do with my very brief introduction so that there is enough time for Harriet to do for us to listen to her lecture. Harriet is Professor of Geography, Energy and Environment at the Department of Geography, and she's also a Deputy Director of Durham Energy Institute at Durham University. Her research interests are in the nature and politics of environmental governance, with a particular focus, of course, on climate change. She is co-author of an agenda-setting and widely cited book on cities and climate change. She's also co-authored another book on governing climate change, and more recently co-edited a book on cities and low-carbon transition. And of course, these are just her books. She's published widely on these topics in several international journals and has undertaken commissioned research for Joseph Rantori Foundation, UN Habitat, and the World Bank, among others. Harriet is an editor of Environment and Planning C Journal and was an editor of Policy and Governance previously. She currently holds a Philip Leverhulme Prize and an ESRC Climate Change Leadership Fellowship on issues of urban transitions. She is co-investigator of several other projects. I don't know where she gets the time. But and these projects examine the relationship between energy use and the dynamics of socio-technical systems, and including among these research, some of these research been funded by various UK research councils. Tonight, Harriet's going to speak about not cities and climate change, but how climate changed cities. Over to you, Harriet. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Simon, for that very kind and lengthy introduction to my work. And I do want to just say before I start today that this lecture is, in some senses, a bit of a retrospective for me in terms of how I've been developing my thinking about climate change in cities over the past 10 years, and that work wouldn't have been possible without a great range of other people and colleagues that I've worked with both in the UK and overseas, and a great team of PhD students and researchers that I've had at Durham. So in terms of where I get the time to do it all, it's mainly because I do it with other people, so I haven't got time to list them all today, but I do want to acknowledge their significant contribution to my work. Now, the title today, lots of the work that I do has somewhere in it the title Cities and Climate Change. But I wanted to reverse that today and to think about the way in which climate might change, or climate change might change the way in which we think about cities. And I want to make the argument that we can no longer think about climate change as a niche or specialist issue that either for research, policy or practice in the city, but instead that climate change is fundamental to the way in which we think about and work through the city. So that's the premise. I hope you're going to enjoy the journey through which to get to that premise today. So what I want to suggest is that climate change is never very far away from the city. Whether this might be in some of the apocalyptic futures that are painted for cities through different forms of cultural expression, such as this from The Day After Tomorrow, perhaps the climate change film. Probably Al Gore would like it to be his film, which was the climate change film, but unfortunately I think it's probably this one. Or whether it's in this kind of expression of the artistic response to climate change. This comes from an exhibition called Postcards from the Future by Robert Graves and Didier Maddock-Jones, which was held at the Museum of London a couple of years ago, through which they started to try to depict what a climate-changed London might look like. Now, of course, these are kind of provocative images. They're expected to kind of expose us to some kind of sense of an alternative set of futures. But within them hold some grain of truth. And this is, if you like, somewhere slightly closer to reality, but still some form of artistic expression. This is the vision of what's called sedimental urbanism, advanced in the counterpart urbanism project in Hong Kong, Shenzhen, where the protagonists of this project suggest that what we need to do is work with natural processes of deposition and sedimentation in the Pearl River Delta in order to address questions of vulnerability and exposure to climate change. A different kind of urbanism emerging in the mind of architects, planners, and ecologists. To this kind of image, which is quite prevalent amongst the NGO community. This is actually taken from WWF Canada's website. It's called Living Planet City. Pleased to see that there's still a donut shop. I don't know whether you can quite make it out. Yes, there it is. There is a donut shop still in the future city. That's all right. But WWF ask visitors to their website, Living Planet City, to, I quote, imagine a world where we are no longer need to burn dirty fuels like coal or oil from the tar sands that cause global warming. It would look a lot like the Living Planet City, where people's homes, workplaces and vehicles are powered by harnessing renewable energy from the sun, wind, water and earth. And it is possible now. The city has become a site of campaigning about climate change, of politics about climate change. And I think that we need to take that kind of movement quite seriously. But aside from those, in some senses, rather fantastical versions of the city and climate change, they may seem far-fetched, but across cities globally, I want to argue, different ways of seeking to engage with climate change are taking place in all sorts of shapes and sizes. The picture on the left, yes, my left and right sorted out, is of Council House 2, a 6 Green Star rated building in Melbourne. It's the new council house, built as a renovation project in the middle of the central business district, quite a challenging engineering project. It does such things as mine the underground networks of wastewater and sewage for heat. It recycles grey water and black water. It contains various different kinds of shading which are responsive to climate and generates its own power and so on. To the top right hand picture, a photograph of a project that a researcher working with me, Gareth Edwards, did some work on, called the Coolest Roof Initiative in Philadelphia, an unlikely trio of Dow Chemicals, the Energy Justice Movement and Philadelphia Greenworks, the City Council, coming together to create that project. Two solar hot water system photographed here by a PhD student of mine, Andreas Luque, in Thane in Mumbai. So we're looking at various different ways and expressions of climate change coming into the city. And those are kind of iconic projects. But there's all sorts of other, much more mundane expressions of climate change in the city. A terrible photograph that I took myself in Times Square, but I couldn't resist the fact that Coca-Cola were advertising that they were advertising their advertising in New York City was powered by wind turbines, and this was in the middle of Times Square. I just couldn't resist it. And colleagues of mine who were at the AAG with me at the time had to wait very patiently while I tried to. It was only on the screen for a couple of minutes at a time, and while I was trying to get the photograph, they had to wait and watch this hoarding for hours. Through to just, solar panels being fitted. This is the electric vehicle scheme in Paris. Again, a photograph I took, just the pavement. There is the kind of icons of addressing climate change becoming kind of littered through the city in some quite interesting ways. So how should we start to make sense of this phenomenon, this idea that climate change is kind of present in multiple kinds of forms and fragments through the city? And in this talk, I want to discuss what the implications are of thinking climate change through the city and thinking the city through climate change around 3 different kind of questions, if you like. And each one of them gets shorter, so in case when we finish the first one you're wondering whether we're ever going to get through the lecture, the first one will be the one that I'll spend the most time on. So first of all, I want to think about how cities are responding to climate change and take some of these issues that I've raised into a little bit more depth to kind of understand the urban response to climate change. I then want to discuss the question of how climate change raises alternative forms and questions of justice for the city. And thirdly, I want to make this argument that climate change might mean that we have to make sense of the city in some quite different ways. So broadly speaking, some of this I will cover at reasonable broad level. There is a lot more detail behind it. I'd be very happy to answer it in questions. But I just wanted to kind of give you a flavour and a summary of where are we after effectively 2 decades of urban action or urban response to climate change. Perhaps in slightly the shadows of the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, and we were at Rio Plus 20 last year, as you know, a small movement began amongst about 14 municipalities in North America and Europe, which was called the Urban Greenhouse Gas Reduction Project, which became something called ICLEI. Well, ICLEI was the organisation, an NGO who sponsored it, but it became ICLEI's Cities for Climate Protection Programme. And that early period of the 1990s, you saw 2 or 3 different municipal networks or transnational networks of municipalities joining together to address climate change. And in somewhat of the shadows of the international response to climate change, these cities started to mobilise their own authorities and increasingly their communities to address climate change. And after 2 decades, I think we could, I'll go into a few of these points in a bit more detail in a minute, but we can broadly say kind of 2,000 or 3,000 cities have put climate change on the urban agenda. It's a bit difficult to actually count them for reasons I could discuss later. Numerous transnational or national networks have been formed that address climate change. There now are about 10 transnational networks and numerous other national or regional networks. There's a diversity of cities involved, from global cities down to small towns and communities, and there's a growing interest in this issue in the global south. There have been some very ambitious targets set at the urban level to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including London, for example, who has a target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 60% by 2050, and of sourcing 25% of their energy needs from within London by 2030. There's a new focus, I think, on issues of vulnerability and adaptation, and a growing range of global institutions, including the United Nations, the World Bank, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, now recognise the city as a legitimate place for responding to climate change. And what I make an argument for in a textbook that I've recently written is that climate change has moved from something of a voluntary issue, what we could call municipal voluntarism, where municipalities were voluntarily addressing climate change out of a series of a kind of moral imperative to do so, through to what we might call a strategic urban concern, where climate change has become part of the political, economic rationale for urban development. So this is the kind of broad picture of what's happening at the urban level, in some senses globally, although I think it's important not to think of globally there as a kind of even terrain through which this is spread, and we'll come to talk about that a bit in a minute. But despite this emphasis on the capacity of cities to manage climate change at the urban level, rather curiously, the evidence that this is being worked out through policies, programs and planning in a way that you might expect urban authorities to respond to climate change is relatively absent. The number of cities who have kind of comprehensive policy and planning approaches is quite limited. I think this sets up a little bit of a paradox, or a paradox that, well, maybe it's not a paradox in the end, but it's useful for me to at least stretch it in that way, to think about a kind of an absence of policy and planning on the one hand, and yet the kind of multiplicity and fragmentation and kind of bits of climate change cities that are evident in multiple urban arenas. And so I wanted to explore this idea of a kind of fragmented multiplicity of responses on the one hand and a kind of a lack of comprehensive policy and planning on the other, as a kind of entry point for thinking a bit more about what the urban response to climate change might be. This is just to give some kind of indication of what I mean by the fact that it's become a strategic issue, and perhaps this is both a kind of cause for celebration and a cause for suspicion, that both the World Bank and the Organisation of Economic the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, and now regard addressing climate change in the city as an urgent agenda, to quote the World Bank. The World Bank doesn't usually work at the urban level. It predominantly funds and provides loans to national governments. So for it to take a specifically urban approach to climate change is in itself intriguing. And the OECD has made this argument that cities and regional governments are well positioned to address climate change. In some senses, for both these organisations, climate change has become an urban agenda. And why is this? Why has climate change come to matter in the city? What's underneath this kind of concern? And we can look at the kind of mitigation and adaptation sides of it, if we like. On the one hand, cities are regarded as centres for the production of greenhouse gas emissions, and although there is significant contestation over these figures, and many of my colleagues, particularly those working at IIED in London, would heavily contest them, the sort of figures that get bandied around is that cities produce around 70% of global energy-related, it's very important, energy-related CO2 emissions. And perhaps the figure that is most exercising organisations such as UN Habitat and the World Bank is this idea of where will the increase in global annual energy demand come from, and 80% of this predicted by the International Energy Agency to come from cities in, effectively in Asia, from cities in non-OECD countries, but predominantly in Asian cities. The World Bank's estimates suggest that we need to think about climate change not as a global, evenly spread issue, but actually as very much as an urban issue, arguing that the world's 50 largest cities generate about 2.6 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent annually. That doesn't very much mean anything in stark figures, but it's more than all of the countries apart from the US and China. So if you had the US emissions, China emissions, and you gathered all the top 50 cities in the world together, they would be the third largest contribution to climate change. So on one hand, cities are regarded as causing the problem. On the other hand, cities are regarded as having the capacity as autonomous levels of government and the potential to gain politically and economically from climate change. In some senses, it's this translation of climate change into an issue for global cities and into an issue for political economy that has created this kind of wave of what I would call strategic urbanism. Adaptation is a little bit different. Historically, the international climate change policy regime and national governments have focused on mitigation, and cities have done so too. Where adaptation was considered, it was considered as a predominantly rural issue, and so cities have been rather left out of the discussion on adaptation. But in the last sort of 3 to 5 years, adaptation's come up the urban agenda. But as this quote from United Nations Habitat report on global human settlements in 2011 on cities and climate change, the first time that it addressed this topic, argues most of the literature on climate change adaptation in cities is focusing on what should be done, not on what is being done, because too little is being done. So there's not really even anything to write about for a group. It was a group of academics who wrote that chapter. For them to say there's nothing to write about really means there is nothing to write about. So the extent to which there's adaptation is happening at the city level is very much behind the mitigation agenda. So in some senses, you could see this story as one of a runaway success. You started in 1991, 1992 with 14 municipalities. We now have 2,000 to 3,000 cities around the world addressing climate change. We have organisations like the World Bank regarding it as a serious issue. We have flows of finance and investment going into cities to address climate change. But there's at least 3 issues that we need to raise before we kind of get carried away with the idea that the urban response to climate change has been a runaway success, or that it can provide some form of panacea. The first is that the implementation challenges of translating these kind of good intentions into action remain very high. The measures of effectiveness are very limited. There is very little evidence about what cities have actually done, and what evidence there is usually reported in multiple different ways. Almost no 2 cities use the same reporting mechanism to say what they've achieved, so it's very difficult to look at an overall picture. And there's this limited evidence of comprehensive urban planning and policy on climate change. And for all of these reasons, there's in some senses a danger that it's becoming regarded that the city is is the city actually incapable, or are cities incapable of addressing climate change? But I want to come back to this idea that there are a plethora of urban initiatives that seek to address climate change that are there, and that my argument really is that we need to pay attention to these kind of initiatives and start to think of them as part of the urban response and not as an isolated set of curiosities on the margins of what might be a proper kind of policy response. And to do that, I'm just going to take a small theoretical diversion and then come back to some more empirical analysis. So the kind of theoretical point behind this then is to argue that what I think this urban response to climate change tells us, the lack of kind of comprehensive policy and planning on the one hand, yet a multiplicity of initiatives on the other, is that we need to change our focus in terms of how we think that governing and authority operate. So predominantly we tend to think of formal institutions, or within the climate change policy world at least, I wouldn't like to speak for the members of this room, within climate change policy, people tend to think of governance as being done something that is done through formal institutions and through particular sets of actors. But different theoretical traditions tell us that authority does not only come from holding positions of power, instead that authority is made and achieved, it is generated through forms of social relations. In that way, we can think of authority and of governing, if governing is a particular set of social relations to which authority is integral, which I would argue it is, that governing is a process through which authority is manifest. So this is what Tanya Murray-Lee in her work on governance suggests, that we need to focus instead of on particular institutions and actors on the way in which a will to improve, the idea that we need to address particular problematics, comes to be mobilised and enter into force. She suggests, along with many other scholars who work in a kind of broadly governmentality tradition, that what we should be looking at is the regimes of practice that seek to govern particular areas or objects or fields through rationalities and technologies, and to create certain kinds of subjectivity. That this is achieved through aligning social and material elements into what Foucault would call the right disposition of things to achieve desired outcomes. So I want to argue then that governing is not confined to the actions of municipalities nor to specific forms of policy and planning, that these projects, pilots, demonstrations, the fragments, if you like, of climate change in the city are in fact the kind of properly political, properly policy-making means through which cities are responding to climate change. They're not part of the sideline, they are, if you like, where real governing is taking place. And I'll make an argument that particular forms of responding to climate change in this way can be regarded as experimental. And here I don't mean experimentation in the sense of a kind of scientific mode of experimentation, but more in the way that you might say to somebody, they're coming around for dinner, I'm experimenting with a new chocolate cake tonight. I've never made it before, but I'm just kind of having a go. Experimentation can mean this idea of trying, putting something to test, and trying to learn from experience. And I want to make the argument that most of a great deal of what we see in terms of urban responses to climate change then is a kind of governing by experiment. And it's a kind of governing that might be important for us to think about for cities more generally. Now to put this to the test, I was lucky enough to have this ESRC fellowship that Simon mentioned. It's actually recently finished, so that's given me a little bit more time to do some other things. But in that ESRC fellowship, one of the things that we did was we did a survey of the level of experimentation happening in 100 cities globally. I'm just going to share a little bit of that data with you. I'm not usually a kind of data person, so this feels a bit weird having figures and things, but hopefully you'll find them of interest. So we looked at 100 cities, and I can tell you how we chose them later if you're interested. But one of the things we looked at was, are these experiments, if we take an experiment as being something which is avowedly novel or trying to put something to the test, or we used a kind of discourse analysis that an intervention or a project would have to, in some senses, regard itself as experimental or innovative. That's how we decided what they were. Are these experiments distributed differently between different kinds of cities? And what we found is that effectively there is no significant difference in the distribution of experiments and the distribution of cities. So in broad terms, we're just as likely to find climate change experiments of the kind that I've just outlined taking place in a city in Africa as you are in a city in Europe. So in some senses, experimentation then can be regarded as a global phenomena of particular kinds of cities, remembering that these are global cities. They are quite heavily clustered, though. If one city tends to have some experiments, it tends to have a lot. So it's not a very even picture. But the other thing that we did, and this was work in particular that Vanessa Castambrotto, who was working with me on the project, did, was to look at how far different kind of some of the usual suspects, if you like, of what makes cities different from one another might explain differences in the levels of experimentation in different cities. But we found that none of these usual suspects, population, GDP, world city ranking, density, land area, explain the amount of experiments that were found. So it wasn't that richer cities had more experiments than poorer cities. It wasn't that cities which had higher densities of population had more experiments than those which had lower densities. Instead, they were that none of those provided explanation. The only thing that did was whether cities were part or not of a city network, of a transnational municipal network. Of course, that could be a function of the data. So rather than being a cause, it could be that if you're part of a transnational city network, you tend to publicise your work more than other cities do. So we can't really regard it as an explanatory factor, but it is at least an interesting point. When we looked at what kinds of experiments were happening, we saw a very similar pattern in terms of the mitigation adaptation divide, so that only about 12, as this figure says, 12% of the experiments, or about 70 out of 630 that we found, were focused on adaptation. The vast majority were focused on mitigation. And the mitigation experiments were heavily dominated by interventions in infrastructure systems and interventions in the built environment, rather than, say, transport, green space, or urban planning. There's a strong focus on energy in these. So in the built environments, about, as it says, 3/4 of them focused on energy. Urban infrastructure, 78% of them focused on energy. This figure is maybe a little difficult to interpret, but there's a very strong difference between energy as a consumption issue and energy as a production issue. In the built environment, most of the kind of interventions focused on energy as a form of consumption, and in urban infrastructure, most focused on energy as a form of production. In some senses, that's not surprising, because we tend to think of urban infrastructures as the ways through which energy is produced, and built environment as a space of consumption. But it does mean that the opposite is not happening. So there's not very much experimentation about using buildings as a site for the production of their own energy. And there's not very much experimentation with trying to reduce consumption through the design of urban infrastructure. So in some ways, these are quite conventional forms of experimentation. They're not really challenging dominant logics of how and why urban infrastructure should be produced, or what we should do with the built environment. They kind of fit into existing logics, which I think is quite important. So when we're saying they're experimental within boundaries. The other thing that we found particularly interesting and I think significant from doing work on cities and climate change in this way is that while municipal governments, or local governments as labelled on this chart, are extremely important in leading most initiatives, they only, and this is in numbers, oh no, it's percentage, okay, see, you can tell I don't do graphs very often. I'm just wondering why we haven't gone up to 100%, but there we are. While municipal governments are extremely important in leading initiatives, once we start to look at who are the partners, we can see the very strong role of the private sector here. So this is part of why we might say that we've kind of moved away from this kind of era of municipal voluntarism, where this was municipalities doing climate change governance or climate change responses on their own. And here we have about 40% of the projects that we looked at had some form of private sector involvement, and almost 20% of them had civil society involvement. But in a lot of kind of quieter registers, that if you focus predominantly on municipalities as the actor, you might have missed the kind of partnerships that we found. Quite a lot more we can say about the database, and indeed we have a paper out in Global Environmental Change on early online view for those of you who want to find out more about it in terms of the data. And we have a paper in Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers which explains further this idea of government by experiment. But just to kind of summarise where we get to when we think about urban responses to climate change, what I've tried to suggest is that they could be artistic and futuristic, they can be iconic and mundane. They can be planned, experimental and improvised. And it's important, I think, that we start to try to open up this idea of what a legitimate form of response to climate change in the city is. And this involves, I think, moving beyond regarding the city and climate change as an issue of management, as an issue of managing the city in particular ways, and thinking instead about the emergent kind of response to climate change that's happening in cities. But in doing that, I think it's important not to move away from the questions of politics that such responses raise, and that's why I want to move on to this question of justice. So questions of the city have, of course, long been framed in terms of questions of justice. And these are questions which have traditionally focused on issues such as work, worklessness, access, housing, planning, and so on. And the environmental justice movement, and this is a picture taken from a blog on environmental justice, has pointed to the potential impacts of environmental harms in terms of refiguring how we might think about justice in the city. And I want to make a second set of arguments, if you like, about the way in which climate change might reframe the city for us here through the lens of justice. There's a very long debate about justice and climate change at the international level, which we can just take a little bit further later on. But what I want to make the argument for here is that by thinking of the city as a kind of legitimate place for urban responses to climate change and a place where politics of climate change is emerging, new climate questions, new questions of justice are asked. And these can be both questions of distributive justice and questions of procedural justice. So in distributive terms, these are some of the kinds of questions that addressing climate change raises. On the first hand, at the moment we have an international system that allocates responsibility to acting on climate change to the national level. But it effectively stops at the gate of the nation state and tells us very little about how different cities or different locations in any one country should be responding to climate change. So there's one issue about, issues of, say, north-south divides in the UK that aren't covered by that, and different kinds of positions that different cities might have within that. But equally, and perhaps in some senses more importantly, there are differences within cities in terms of how rights and responsibilities are distributed around climate change, in terms of the responsibilities for emissions of greenhouse gases, rights to access the kinds of benefits that addressing climate change might bring, rights to be protected from the impacts of climate change, and questions of who should pay for the costs of responding to climate change. None of which are, I think, at the moment taken into account. Those of you who are kind of interested in this issue broadly in the UK, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation have been doing a series of excellent studies on this work, and on Wednesday released some work done by the Centre for Sustainable Energy at Bristol, which suggests that the top 10% income earners in the UK contribute something like 3 times greenhouse gas emissions of the lowest 10%, and is asking the government to think carefully about what that means in terms of achieving reasonably radical cuts of 60% or 80% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Who should bear the cost and why? Equally, we need to ask questions about whether issues of procedural justice are being addressed. And one of the rationales for addressing climate change at the urban level has been the rhetoric that cities are the level of government closest to the people. This is a rhetoric used often by municipalities making the claim to act on climate change. But in a quick survey of my class of about 30 students who take a course on this, only 3 of them have ever voted in a local government election. I know they're not very old, but I'm not going to do the same survey here. But I think we can raise some quite legitimate questions about whether municipal governments are the level of government closest to the people. And in what sense they are or could be. And in my work on climate change over the last 10 years, I've found that it is predominantly an expert-led arena, and there are very limited examples of where public participation has been central to the development of climate change responses. Going beyond that kind of, if you like, a first step of public engagement, there are broader and more difficult questions about whether those who might normally be excluded from processes of decision making are being included in the climate change issue, particularly when it's an issue that might often seem distant concern to everyday realities. And thirdly, and perhaps most difficult, is are those who have a responsibility to take part, either because of their contribution to greenhouse gas emissions or because of their capacity to respond, are they being engaged in the process? To some extent, we can see that that is emerging as, in some senses, a corporate response to climate change. You could make an argument that that's about taking some level of responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions from that sector. But most urban responses to climate change are based on universal targets for the whole city as a whole and limited consideration for differential impacts. And even if we want to move beyond the, in some senses, reasonably straightforward ideas of distribution and procedural justice as inclusion, to think about this principle of justice as recognition, which requires that we acknowledge how and why responses and experiences of climate change are uneven and take that into account in policy making, we really require quite a step change in how urban responses to climate change are being addressed. And I think this urban focus highlights the inadequacies of a framework of climate justice advanced at the international level, which is rooted in predominantly liberal principles of distribution. And it does ask us to think about the ways in which uneven structures of rights, responsibilities around greenhouse gas emissions and around adaptation are actually produced. There are many implicit ways, however, in which notions of climate justice are being explored within cities, and I think they open up questions of what a just city might be or might have to become, that moves us beyond a kind of straightforward idea of social justice. And these are just two very quick examples, and again, I haven't got really time to illustrate this in significant depth, but I'm very happy to do so further. But one of the questions we've asked, as well as doing this broad survey, Vanessa, Gareth, myself, and researchers, PhD researchers who've worked with me on the Climate Change Fellowship, have started to ask in the case study work that we did, is about this idea of how responsibilities and rights and inclusion have been structured through the kind of experiments or interventions that we've looked at. And here are just two short examples. One from a project called Towards Zero Emissions in Bangalore, where we found very much an emphasis on this idea of self-government, of individual responsibility for climate change. This is a zero carbon development on the outskirts of Bangalore, targeted at the IT industry workforce and middle class residents. Its argument is that you can have a low carbon existence with no compromise for a middle class lifestyle, although there are quite a lot of compromises involved, which again I'll talk about a little bit later if you want. But one of the clear things in TZ is this idea of a conscience meter. Every flat or house is fitted with what is called a conscience meter, and it's supposed to tick on your conscience, your energy use, your water consumption, and so on. There is direct regulation also to try to create a sense of a low carbon disposition, the kind of fridges you can use, the baths you can have, the showers you can have. People are encouraged to grow their own vegetables. Many of the people that we spoke to in the development, who lived in this development, said that when they were working 12 or 14 hours a day in the IT industry in Bangalore, there wasn't a lot of time for growing organic vegetables. But there is this idea of trying to create a sense of self-responsibility, and there are then questions about whether that is an adequate or just way of responding to climate change. In Hong Kong, some work that I did with a program that WWF have developed called Climateers, there's a stronger sense, if you like, of government by community. Again, a kind of sense of self-help and self-reliance as a means of achieving governmental ends. There's an ambassador scheme which they develop where you are, as an individual, you're taken to a set of field sites in and around Hong Kong, to a coral reef and to a bioreserve, to look at what the potential impacts on climate change might be, and you're encouraged to get you pledge yourself to reduce emissions, and you have to sign up pen friends to do the same in your local community, your local area, and you're supposed to act as a kind of ambassador or a leader for the impacts of climate change. And then it's further developed in specific areas of Hong Kong through community group projects, including low carbon youth, a low carbon cooking group, there's low carbon bicycling. I don't know whether you can get any more low carbon than bicycling, but that's the types of responses that they're trying to create a sense of kind of social networking. And I think it's an interesting response, but it comes and takes the place of a complete lack of response by Hong Kong government, who effectively feel that the response to climate change should be waiting for China to build a new nuclear power station to supply them with energy, and indeed heavily subsidise electricity bills, and last year gave all Hong Kong residents a rebate of about £60 on their electricity bill as a means of redistributing the large amount of tax that they had gained that year from the business sector. So there's a sense here that communities are seeking to take responsibility for governing climate change in the absence of the state in both of these cases, in ways that might cause us to ask questions about whether that is a kind of just response. There's a bit more there, but I'm running out of time. Okay, so finally I want to come to this discussion about how climate change as an urban problem might change our sense of what the city is. And to suggest that climate change is an urban problem isn't to make an exclusive claim that it is not also a rural, national, international or personal problem, but what it is to do is to argue that it matters how climate change comes to make sense and to be framed and thought about, and of the politics that then arise. So I want to reflect on what is at stake in making some of these kind of bold claims that go with the territory of thinking climate change through the city. This quote from the mayors of some of the world's most powerful cities ask you to recognise that the future of our globe will be won or lost in the cities of the world. That is a reasonably strong claim, but one that certainly several of them believe. So what has climate change come to mean at the city level, and how might climate change our sense of what the city is? These two quotes, one from Solar, a novel by Ian McEwan, the other from Transition Town Network, again get to this kind of artistic register of responses to climate change, which I think is an important way through which we can kind of think about how cities are responding to climate change. One, I like this particular here, that this was coming down over a big city. The lead character is in an aeroplane at this moment. The giant concrete wounds dressed with steel, generating a heat, a modern kind of heat, the hot breath of civilization. He felt it. Everyone was feeling it on the neck or in the neck. We're feeling climate change in the neck. Transition towns, on the other hand, are cooperatively creating happier, fairer and stronger communities, places that work for the people living in them and are far better suited to dealing with the shocks that will accompany our economic crisis. And I think this kind of dystopian and utopian thinking that accompanies this response to climate change, they're kind of at the ends of a spectrum in some ways. But I think underpinning a lot of how climate change is being made sense of as an urban issue is in these kind of dystopian and utopian registers. I think we then if we add this kind of utopia, dystopian kind of spectrum together with some dominant tropes about the city as either a place for planning, management, and intervention, or as a place which is emergent, slightly chaotic, and in some senses running out of control, we can kind of think of there being four different ideal ways, if you like, or different kind of tropes about urban responses to the city, which are urban responses to climate change, which are in currency. I mean, you know, it's a simplistic device, but I hope it at least helps to kind of illustrate the point that in some senses there is no one set of urban responses to climate change. There is no one way in which climate change is being made sense of in the city. It is being made sense of in multiple ways. So climate change comes to be not one issue but many through the urban. And I think that's a particularly important thing that figuring climate change through the city has done. How the city has made, in some sense, sense of climate change. But equally, I think climate change poses some more fundamental questions about how we make sense of the city as well, as scholars and practitioners and those interested in cities. It raises questions of boundaries, of where the urban begins and ends, Does the urban begin with the greenhouse gas emissions that come here, and does it end with the implications, the impacts of that emissions on distant places? Of power, of the nature and role of the state, and what constitutes authority in the urban? Of politics, where are legitimate sites for being political? Are they in our carbon footprint? Are they in the decisions that we make in the supermarket, or are they only in public spaces? Where is the site of the properly political here? And of about ordinary urbanism, in a way, about how some daily experiences come to be viewed in relation to climate change, tropes, and others subjected to the physical impacts of climate change. So some of those images at the start of the talk today suggested climate change has become integrated into the daily lives of millions through their experiences of events that are regarded as climate change events, or emblematic and mundane forms of urbanism, whether it's because you happen to trip over a sign of an electric car on a pavement, or whether it's because you go to a kind of iconic film. Urban life is lived through these various fragments and fractures of climate change. It possesses in some ways a ubiquity that suggests we can't somehow separate it out from the rest of our concerns for the urban and proceed as if it can be cast on and off at will. Climate change, then, I want to suggest, can no longer be partitioned as one of many issues confronting the urban agenda, but instead, as I hope I've illustrated, in the ways in which responses to climate change are being governed and practiced, in the questions of justice that climate change raises, and in how it comes to challenge what the city might be and what it might become, and equally how cities are reshaping what climate change is regarded as an issue. I want to make the claim that climate has changed cities. Thank you.
Thank you. We do still have time for questions and comments and discussions. Especially Harriet was sort of teasing us through us that there is plenty more to be said. Yes. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Marek Bidwell.
Can you speak up, please? Because we don't have
My name is Marek
microphone.
Bidwell.
Thanks,
Thank you very
Marek.
much for a very interesting presentation. Amongst all of your international travelling, I don't know if you get to spend much time in the northeast. But if you do, I just wondered if you, how you rated our local council's responses to climate change, either Durham or Newcastle or Middlesbrough or anywhere else that you're familiar with.
Do you want me to, I'm quite happy to do one of them? Yeah, of course.
If you happen to
So before I moved here, I did some work on how Newcastle had responded to climate change. And then since I've arrived, I haven't really done anything. So I looked at how Newcastle had developed its response to urban energy issues during the 1990s. And indeed, Newcastle was one of the pioneering local authorities in joining some of these early transnational networks and partly responsible for forming a network called Energy Cities in the mid-1990s. And took a very interesting and I think an early strategic approach to thinking about what energy questions might mean for the economic development of the city. So I have written a bit about that response, and I've also written a little bit about urban planning in Newcastle and how some of the planning policies in the turn of the millennium were also seeking to try to address some questions about consumption and growth at the same time, and framed in some senses around climate change issues. But I haven't worked on it since then. I do know that the North East Councils collectively were the first area of the UK to join something called the Covenant of Mayors, which maybe some of you have heard of, a European agreement which asks councils to commit to quite significant reductions of greenhouse emissions, and also unlike some of the other networks that I've mentioned, the European Covenant of Mayors actually sort of slightly means it, that when you set a target, you have to achieve it, and if you don't achieve it, you're asked to politely, as I understand it, to leave. So I think there are some innovations happening, and Durham has got a big program around micro renewables as well. So there is definitely action happening in the northeast, but more than what I've just described, I wouldn't be able to kind of analyse it for you. No, that's all right. It's a reasonable point. I do work. One of the big projects that I work on is called, well, it's an Ofgem funded smart grid project which works across Yorkshire, the North East. So that's where I do my work in this region, is on smart grids. So I have got a bit of a footprint here.
Thank you. Yes. Well, you and then.
Perhaps a follow-up. Hugh Hill. I work for Northumberland County Council, so I'm not one of the urban authorities, but we are one of the participants in Covenant of Mayors. And I think the reality at the moment, it's slightly sort of parked. We're not quite, we're still there. Government mayor's actually got bigger than anyone thought it was going to be, and I think Europe is struggling a bit with it. But my question was going to be slightly more general than that. You've emphasised quite rightly the importance of municipalities, local government. But I just wonder, in the UK context, where the financial pressures on municipalities, and a Secretary of State who tells us the most important thing is we should be collecting the bins once a week because it's a fundamental human right, and an awful lot of other stuff's getting cut. Is there a danger that a lot of the innovation is just going to get overtaken by the sort of immediate crisis of service delivery and things, and we just won't be able to do some of these things? I just wonder whether, from your experience elsewhere in the world, there's a lot of the world facing austerity. Are we going to be able to continue to do these things?
Take another one.
Yeah.
Then we come back. Yes,
Yeah.
John.
I should probably say that I work on a sort of part-time basis for the Association of North East Councils, and was involved in organising the local authorities to sign the Covenant of Mayors four years ago. But I do fully agree with Hugh's point that the UMP, if you like, has gone out of a lot of this agenda over the last 4 years, victim, as Hugh rightly says, of other priorities. So actually my question wasn't going to be about that at all. My question was a very basic one, a simple one, possibly an emotional one, and that is, how optimistic are you in the light of all of this work, and in the light of comments that Hugh's made, I've made, and I'm sure you've heard 100 times, carbon emissions are 48 times higher than they were 20 years ago at the time of Rio. How optimistic are you that the plethora of examples that we get? When I started this work, what I noticed was that there's no end of examples, pilots of good work. It's actually institutionalising that's the issue. So my question is, how optimistic are you that we're going to be able to institutionalise all of this pilot work to make a difference?
Okay. All right. Well, I'll take these two. Thank you both very much, and thanks for coming to listen today, because I'm sure you've got a lot more expertise in actually how to make this work than I have. But to start with this question about the change of agenda, I think one of the really interesting things here is about the types of cities that get involved and why they do. And it's also a question, I think it does also come back to a question of responsibilities. So I think climate change has become an ever more important issue in the biggest cities of the world. So I think the global cities, New York, Toronto, Rio, Sao Paulo, these are the cities where climate change is becoming this kind of strategic urban issue. I think, and in the UK, I would say that it has traditionally been in the kind of top 8 cities that climate change has had the most political support. It has been at a kind of smaller town and urban area that is, in some senses, had the most, this kind of idea of municipal voluntarism, where local authorities are working themselves on it. So I think it matters a little bit what kind of city you're talking about in terms of both where the agenda is and where's the political will and where's the support for it. And in some senses, if we take it very much in kind of just greenhouse gas emissions terms, and also then a sense of responsibility, is it in those top 50 cities that we should actually be trying to achieve the most action? That's one question that we could ask ourselves quite legitimately, I think. If those are the cities where most of the greenhouse gas emissions are being produced, is that where we need to focus our action and attention? So that's one way of responding to that question. I think in terms of this idea of, is putting the bin out every week a human right and addressing climate change not really a human right, I think one of the most kind of disappointing things about the politics around this issue in the last 3 years has been this kind of increasing opposition between the idea of the economy and the environment, despite a significant kind of, in some senses, a significant move by the environmental movement to the green economy agenda, and a significant kind of campaigning by a whole set of different organisations that are addressing the economic issues that we face in this country is actually something that we could do at the same time as reducing greenhouse gas emissions. When you're thinking about where and why does money go out of an economy, well, pumping houses full of hot air that can't actually then retain that heat is one great way of getting rid of a whole set of money from an economy, if you would like to. Another way of doing it is to pay all of your energy bills to international energy companies rather than through community-owned energy companies. Another way is not to have a kind of refurbishment industry that could address some of these issues. So I don't actually believe that those two things should be in opposition or are necessarily in opposition. I agree that they are politically framed in opposition at the moment, and that is very problematic. So in some senses, I'm optimistic because I think in some of the most politically powerful cities of the world, there's no longer a kind of option not to talk about climate change. When Ken Livingstone came out of power in London, Boris Johnson came into power. Now, did we think that Boris Johnson was going to kind of embrace an idea of climate change? No, because he was a skeptic. Did we think that Boris Johnson would say that London should provide 25% of its own energy from its own sources? No, we thought he'd think that that was a kind of radical socialist kind of policy and he'd get rid of it. But he hasn't done either of those things. He's kept both of them. And he's kept both of them because the industry interests in London believe that those two things need to be pursued. So I'm optimistic in some senses. I am pessimistic about the scale of the challenge. I yesterday listened to a talk by Kevin Anderson from Tyndall Centre, Manchester. If anybody wants to get very pessimistic very quickly, listen to a talk by Kevin Anderson because he tells you what the scale of the challenge is and you think there's just no way out of it. But so if you're feeling slightly optimistic, please listen to Kevin. But I do think there are grounds for optimism, and I think it's an argument that we need to win. I mean, I think it's this event yesterday at Joseph Rowntree Foundation on whether there can be a just response to climate change. I think there's a sense that we're kind of losing the argument that climate change can be something through which we address economic problems, through which we address issues of social justice. I think we need to start trying to win that argument a bit more.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Peter Ackley, I'm a PhD student here. You talked about the correlation between membership of the international networks and the experimentation that cities have been involved with. Were you able to identify whether it kind of go a bit further than that, maybe identify whether the experimentation, the initiatives were similar, depending on whether they joined the particular networks, whether there was a sharing of ideas across the cities?
Yeah, thank you, which allows me to come back to the institutionalization part of the last question that I didn't respond to either. In some senses, yes. There are some quite interesting ways in which similar ideas are travelling across networks. One of them is a bus rapid transit system. For any of you who have not heard of a BRT before, bus rapid transit is effectively a municipal transportation system, but rather than building subways, one builds bus lanes and one provides bus services, and it's much, as you can imagine, much cheaper to build kind of roads on the top and lanes and things like that than it is to build a whole underground system. But it's also able to cope with a much bigger kind of suburban dispersed settlement than a metro system is. The idea started in a couple of cities in Latin America funded by the Inter-American Development Bank and has effectively been spread through both the Inter-American Development Bank and through the C40, which is one of the big networks of global cities, so that there are now BRT schemes being trialled in Johannesburg and in Cape Town, in cities in India, from this initial experimentation in Latin America. So you can see some types of experimentation travelling between cities. There are also parts of these networks set up particular things to do, like establishing energy service companies for office buildings, and they provide funding for that, and so then 20 cities all do the same thing. So they can act in that way as aggregators of ideas as well. So there is some commonality and sharing of ideas going on, but not as much as you might expect or hope for. And that's usually because, well, most cities are keen to be a best practice or something. There is not so much interest in learning from other people's best practice. There's a bit of an issue about how learning happens. But it comes back to this idea of institutionalization, and in some senses what I was trying to argue in my talk is a question about how far we need institutionalization in order to be an adequate response. I mean, there's a scale problem, there's a scale of the challenge problem, but if things weren't institutionalized, so they weren't organized, but there was just lots of it, would that be okay? Or do we need to organise it in order for there to be lots of it? And I just don't think that there's necessarily an answer to that question, which is very straightforward. Because some things travel in that way. They might not be scaled up in a particular place, but they're scaled through multiple different sites. And that's a different kind of way of things happening. So the institutionalisation scaling up question is an interesting one. But I'm not necessarily an advocate for making things necessarily formal and obligatory in order to achieve it, because I think most of what's happening is kind of happening at the edges of what you can achieve formally, and I wouldn't want to limit that kind of response.
There aren't any hands showing, but there is one.
Yes.
But I'm going to take a question myself before that one. And it's a question related to the kind of the core of your talk, Harriet, which I really, very, very interesting sort of discussion about the climate sense of the city. And I was just wondering, how do you think that climate sensing of the city is distinct from the broader environmental or sustainability sense of the city? What is distinct about climate change that wasn't there when we were talking about sustainability or broader environmental consciousness?
Yeah.
You want me to take the next one, or
I can do it either way, whichever you like.
Well, maybe you just
Yeah,
yes.
you're the chair. You're the
Okay.
you're in the seat.
Yes, I'm
You're in
using
power.
I'm using my
Use your power.
yes.
Govern me,
Go on.
please. Yeah, I mean it's a very interesting question. I would make probably three responses to it, and I think they come from some of the work and concepts of other people that I've used. Their ideas partly here. One is from an argument created by Aidan Weil and his colleagues, that what we're witnessing is a process by which the state itself has become restructured around carbon in a way which sustainability never managed to achieve the restructuring of the state and what the state's interests were. And I think that's because there's a different political economy to carbon than to other issues. And so carbon is something which can achieve the reproduction of the state in a way that other kind of environmental issues haven't so far been able to do. And so in that sense, you get a different sort of network of actors finding themselves having an interest in addressing climate change. And it is a very bizarre world where the top 100 companies in the UK are telling the Chancellor that he is not taxing them enough environmentally. I mean, that is a very strange world to live in, but that is nonetheless what is happening. It's a strange world when it's Ken Livingstone and Arnold Schwarzenegger that we're depending on to respond to climate change. It's a very odd world, but there's a political economy of carbon that wasn't there previously. I think the second thing is this idea that Simon Marvin and Mike Hodson have made of a kind of an ecological security that comes with climate change. The idea that climate change requires the securing of critical infrastructures, but through ecological systems. So you see, one of the interesting things I think in adaptation work is that you see an increasing interest in green infrastructures, blue infrastructures through cities, that they come to have value, not necessarily an economic value, but in a value like, so mangroves or coastal swamps, or they come to have a value because they protect the city from the impacts of climate change. And I think that security issue is another one. But I think the third one is actually the fact that climate change, in some ways, unlike sustainability, has, maybe not as dominantly as the other two discourses about it as an urban issue, but it has been mobilised around questions of social justice. So it's becoming regarded as a means through which you might be able to provide the right kind of jobs, you might be able to address issues of economic deprivation, you might be able to create green forms of development. So some work PhD students working with me have done in Sao Paulo and in Cape Town have shown that the idea of of low carbon housing is becoming a means through which, particularly in Sao Paulo, the idea is being associated with the notion of a dignified house. That normal kind of state housing, which provides people with somewhere to live, provides them with shelter, but requires them then to pay their energy bills for the rest of their lives, and effectively may leave them in debt to energy companies and so on, is not a dignified way to lead life. But instead that the provision of solar hot water and the provision of renewable energy with that house provides people with a kind of dignity that they should be aspiring to. And in that way, climate change has started to change the debate in Sao Paulo about whether you should provide housing for everybody or whether you should provide better quality housing for fewer people, in a way that you couldn't have got that somehow with sustainability.
Over there.
It's kind of loosely related
last one, but I was just wondering if you'd agree, try to say that we're too obsessed with CO2 and carbon or whatever when we talk about climate change, because that's well, obviously we have so many strategies and responses to those problems, but then when we backtrack those problems and we think of those responses, we always see that they're almost labeling CO2 reduction or otherwise as to the key focus. And well, there's a whole more lot to it. That's for example, when we talk about greenhouse gases, we're talking about emissions. Who's going to take care of those, for example, nitrous oxides, particulates, and stuff like that?
So in terms of being too obsessed with carbon dioxide, there are reasons to be obsessed with carbon dioxide, and that's because it is the most prevalent greenhouse gas, and it does make the most contribution to global warming and the rest of it. And the other reason that we get obsessed with it is for the reason that I gave to Simon as our first answer about the fact that it has a political economy to carbon, in a sense, and at the urban level. The other kind of greenhouse gas emissions that you were talking about, nitrous oxides, I can't ever say them, HCFCs, we'll just leave them at that, because I'm not going to get their whole acronym right. Those things are increasingly looked after actually through the CDM, through the Clean Development Mechanism, and one of the criticisms of the Clean Development Mechanism is it focuses too much on those gases and not enough on carbon dioxide. So in some senses it might be a happy medium with the Clean Development Mechanism, focuses on those gases which come from large industrial plants, mainly in China and India and elsewhere, which is the easiest greenhouse gas emissions to claim CDM credits for because they're kind of the most contained. There's a methane issue that is probably the least governed greenhouse gas at the moment, I would say.
Right. Maybe this should be the final question, and this room is getting colder and colder somehow. And we take that, and then after that.
Thank you. Thank you for an interesting talk. Just in brief, and this follows on a lot from Samin's question. I guess what I'm wondering is, in terms of the research and the research project you've been working on, what sort of role would you say there is for adaptation by stealth or unconscious adaptation, in the sense that where things are happening, behaviors are changing in city planning and so forth, that doesn't necessarily latch on to this? And I know for my own research on the EPA, where certain regions during, for instance, the George W. Bush era deliberately were misleading as to they were doing climate change adaptation. They just didn't say they were. I'm curious how we get at that and what the implications of those kinds of things. Is there more going on than we think? Does it matter, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very interesting question. And I think there's both kind of mitigation by stealth and adaptation by stealth happening. I think, well, it's a big question. How do we research it? How do you research something that nobody's talking about? Tricky. And only, I think, by being there, really. I mean, I think you can only really research it by being in the places and kind of uncovering why people are doing things. I think, does it matter? Does it mean that there's more going on? What I think is interesting is that, and it partly kind of, I hope at least it supports the argument that I'm making, that in some senses climate change is becoming a kind of normalised. That when you're deciding whether you're going to build a new bridge or a new, whatever, big facility, you could, almost through kind of insurance requirements and assessments of that kind, it's becoming part of a kind of mundane and practical, technical kind of set of decisions. So in some sense it's becoming woven into those urban decisions in that way. Whether that's by stealth or whether that's just because it's becoming normalised, I'm not quite sure whether that's the right response. But certainly there is a lot of action that's increasingly talked about in terms of energy rather than climate change, because energy is something which there's still a legitimate politics about. And there is a question whether after 20 years of kind of efforts to try to do climate politics in a particular way, where you say climate change is a big, scary problem, here we've got all the science to prove it, would you please all do something about it? There's a question whether that kind of politics of climate change, and in particular, will all the nation states take their responsibilities and do something about it? I think that kind of politics is probably over. And for people who want to explore that idea a bit more, I'll plug a book that a colleague of mine in Canada has written called Climate Change at the Crossroads, and his subtitle is Experimenting with a Global Response. So you see, I'm plugging him because we kind of share similar kind of thinking about experimentation. But his name's Matthew Hoffman, and he makes a case for why we need a different kind of global politics around climate change.
Well, should we again thank Harriet for a wonderful lecture and for answering all those questions so thoroughly in such details. Thanks
Thank you
very
very
much.
much for having me.